good to see, as I always tell you, all of you and each of you. And thank you for coming to share a few words of Torah as we prepare ourselves for Yom Kippur. I did the coward's trick of providing a somewhat controversial sounding topic. Sounds like incendiary. Everybody was, I saw the fire department was outside already. I don't think that anything is going to happen that is going to be registered as an earthquake or cause a tsunami or anything of that nature. But before I start, I would just like to, as always, to thank Sharon for making this such a warm and welcoming place to share Torah. I know that I feel it as soon as I walk into the room. And also to thank the SDC, which is figuratively the Makom Torah, wherever it is that we meet, whether it's in Friedlander's basement, or whether it's in my dining room, or whether it's here, wherever we are, it feels like a warm, safe place. I had promised to talk today about inclusiveness and its limitations. So let me first make some limitations myself. I think that the topic, when that expression is used, it is often used as something more or less in the spirit of what they call it, Title IX, or civil rights, that those who have traditionally, for one reason or another, been excluded should now be included. That has come to be people who are excluded by reason of prejudice, people who are excluded because they have various kinds of disabilities and special needs, and accommodating their needs is part of the doctrine, shall we say, of inclusion. I would caution that it is always dangerous to adopt carelessly ideas which are formulated outside of Judaism, and because they sound benevolent, to immediately say they are Judaism. And this is a common mistake, particularly in the liberal progressive community, which has basically taken the agenda and moved it wholesale. Certainly you see this in, under the broad terms like Tikkun Olam, etc., has just sort of moved it in unexamined. Well, this is, there may be many elements which are actually quite harmonious with Jewish tradition, because don't forget that the impulse to benevolence, the impulse to justice and mercy, has its deepest roots in our civilization, in Western civilization, certainly has its deepest roots in Jewish tradition, which was later, in a slightly different form, adopted by Christianity. So it should be no surprise that certain elements resonate. However, I think we should be very careful, because the Torah really works on a different basis in its notion of who is included in that kind of discussion. So, for example, someone coming from the doctrine of inclusion would find it perhaps offensive that not anybody who wants to grow up to be a Kohen can be a Kohen. Furthermore, they would find it offensive that if a young Kohen has certain physical defects and anomalies, that he is not allowed to perform all of the functions of the kahuna because of what is seen as a physical imperfection that doesn't allow him to do that. Now, in a modern secular context, those kinds of restrictions would be objectionable first because we work on the premise of individual self-actualization. That every human being has the right to be whatever he or she, and now it, wants to be, and I don't mean that as a joke, I'm saying that with sensitivity, that They have a right to perform any function to which they aspire, assuming that they work hard enough, sometimes with an extra push if they didn't quite make it. And that self-actualization is the goal of human life. Well, of course, the Torah works on a very different premise. First of all, the Torah works on a premise which is much more geared toward the larger picture of the community and the world and its work, as opposed to the particular centrality of individual self-actualization. Second, the individual has only one ultimate goal, and that is to serve the Almighty. That the service of the Almighty is itself the only source of what we could call true existential success in a human life. And the question of what it is God has called us to do is a question which has answers from many different sources. Part of it is how we're born. Was our father a Kohen or was our father not a Kohen? Right? But whatever those determinations are, we have the notion of Echad HaMarbe ve'Echad HaMam'it, that how much one does is less significant than the quality of one's service from the position which is created by the various vectors of situation. And so the great example of the concept of the Korban Ola V'Yored, that depending on a person's economic status, in certain categories of offerings, they could be offering anything from a large animal, which was quite expensive, to a couple of birds, to a handful of flour. And all of these offerings would accomplish more or less the same thing insofar as God's view of the person. That they are a success in the view of God. It is only when the gaze shifts, when we move from being deocentric to focusing our lives on service of the divine, to, some would say, service of humanity, but even more important is service in the awareness of other human beings. So that a person who is performing a function that brings more fame or carries more power is accorded by society greater importance. That person is thought to be more successful. Well, you know, you have to look at the judges if you want to figure out the value of the contest. And if your judges are flesh and blood, even more if your judges are the kind of fickle, tension deficit hangers-on who push like on an iPhone and give a person suddenly 50,000, quote, followers. If a person is designated as an influencer, none of these titles are relevant in the God view. God will never ask anyone, how famous were you? The questions that God will ask are much more geared to what did you fashion of yourself, and with what intent in the time allotted to serve your master in this world. And that is how we determine who is a success. Therefore, obviously, the question of what do we need to be included in in order to have our chance to have a successful, meaningful life, you're going to come out with different answers. Because the contest is being judged by two different sets of judges. But I mention that only as a side note to say that the notion of inclusion as a Jewish value needs to be examined and understood in terms of truly Jewish categories and not imported wholesale from another thought system, because that may be fraught with mistakes. However, where our tradition is interested in the question of inclusion is along the lines of the moral qualities of individuals. And there we face a kind of a tension, a dialectic, because on one hand we have articulated in many forms, perhaps the simplest is the one articulated by Nitai the Arbalite in the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, Al tischaber lorosha. Do not have an association with a wicked person. Wickedness is seen to be something which is contagious. So that would sound like we should disinclude wicked people from our lives. Now, how we define wicked, we'll discuss another time. The question is, what happens, how does a community approach this question of al tischaber lorosha? What does a community do when it, in one way or another, identifies evil individuals in its midst? Does the community follow the dictum of al tischaber lorosha? Does the community function as a filtered group of, let's say, righteous people and in-between people, regular people? Because the sages use this category of Beinoni, an individual person, because it's frankly very difficult to find anyone who is truly righteous. You know what I always say? It's like, when you're doing a wedding, it takes a very big Talmid Chacham to write a ksuba that no one will have any question about. Because there are guys out there that are like heat-seeking missiles. And you can always tell when some, non-practicing rabbi shows up early to the chassan's tish. And they always do one of these. They come over the table and go,
That's good.
Just the ksuba? I think this nun is a little long. I would have put these two words a little further apart. I've seen these guys. It was very early in my career when I encountered my first one. Oh my gosh. First my stomach started to flutter. Then I channeled my grandfather. Not the rabbi, he was as gentle as a lamb. My other grandfather, who was a public school teacher, who did his work through the Leon Rifkin eyebrow system. Now his eyebrows were very daunting, but they were basically de-weaponized when he was smiling. However, when he got stern, the two eyebrows moved into fighting position. And when they touched, there was like this click. You could hear the bombs getting into place. And he would just give this look. And it was known to wither houseplants. And I channeled my grandfather, and I turned to this old geezer and I said, that nun is fine. Okay. He was not going to war with Leon Rifkin over that nun. So, but the rabbis recognize that we are all but the only thing, it takes a bigger Talmud Chacham than to write a perfect ksuba. You have to be a big Talmud Chacham to write a ksuba that is perfectly puzzle. Unless you called the bride Rivka Rachel, you can make something out of almost any ksuba, right? It's really hard to do it totally right or totally wrong. So it is with us. There are very few real tzaddikim and very few real rishoyim. Most of us are in the middle, or at least that's the way we like to think about ourselves. Right? So we're in the middle. We could use some improvement, but we're not the kind of person that we have to throw out. Okay. Well, what if you have some real rishoyim? Do we become exclusive? Do we put them out? Here, we have a tradition which comes to ground. It's unusual for a passage in the what seems to be the Agadic literature to come to ground in two halachic areas. The first halachic area we encounter in the Tur, as the Tur describes the beginning of the Rosh Hashanah, of the Yom Kippur evening service. Arvis nichnosim lebeis hakneses. In the evening we enter the synagogue, v'nohagim be'Ashkenaz. And the custom is in Ashkenazic communities, shekodem sheyispalel, matirim l'chol ha'arvaryonim. We give permission to all of those who are transgressors. I knew they'd get me out of this. Kedei lehispalel imahem, in order that we be able to pray with them. And important words, the Tur adds, va'afilu im lo yevakshu yesheyatiru lahem. Even if they didn't ask us to countenance them. Why? And here he quotes a Gemara from Krisus. The Amar of Shimon Chasido, we have a tradition in the name of Rav Shimon Chasido, called Tainis Tzibur She'ein Bo Miposh'ei Yisrael. Any public fast that does not include Jewish sinners, Eino Tainis. It is not considered to be a valid fast. Shahare Chelbana Rechara, because one of the key ingredients that the Torah mentions in Parshas Kisisa, one of the key ingredients in the incense, the Ketores, in the Beis HaMikdash, the Ketores, which by the way is absolutely pivotal on Yom Kippur especially. One of the key ingredients is Chelbana, the fragrance of which is actually bad, is unpleasant. Umino'a kosuvim samone haktoras. But nevertheless, even though this particular element is foul-smelling, it is included among the other ingredients of the Ketores. So this is a very important Gemara, this Gemara from Krisus, and it tells us that we have this this notion that we need of what we would call inclusion. That the Poshei Yisrael, the sinners, need to be there in order for the fast to work. The concept of inclusion comes up again in this season in regard to the constitution of the, no one ever heard this phrase, the festival bouquet, known as the Daled meaning, the Lulav and Esrog. My grandfather always called it the festival bouquet. As I've told you many times, my grandfather, Zichrono Libracha, had mellifluous phrases in English for just about everything. Anyway, that festival bouquet is mentioned several places in the Midrash, but a very important Gemara in Menachos. And in the Gemara in Menachos it says, Daled minim shebalulav, of the 4 species represented in the bouquet, Beis mehem osim peros, ubeis mehem ein osim peros. 2 of them produce fruit and 2 of them do not. The fruit producers, of course, being the lulav itself, which produces dates, and the esrog, which is the fruit. The osim peros yiyuz zekukim l'she'ein osim. V'she'ein osim peros yu zikukim le'osim peros. And the two species which are fruitful have an absolute need for the company of those which are not, and vice versa. Ve'ein adam yotze yidei chovaso bohen ad shu kulam ba'agudo achas. And one cannot fulfill one's obligation until they are all bound together. V'chein Yisrael b'hartzoa ad sheyu kulam ba'agudo achas. So too with the Jewish people, they need to be in a single unit. And here, interestingly, he quotes a verse which is also a secondary source for the Gemara in Krisus, which talks about including the sinners of Israel. It's a verse from the prophet Amos, and it says, Habone v'shamayim, Ma'alosav, the Almighty who creates his towers in the heaven, the agudaso al eretz yisoda. But his aguda, his bundle, is founded on the earth. In other words, the sense of God's connection to the world, which we understand is the Jewish people, is the work of spirit, is described as an aguda. It is described as a bound bundle. Right? And so the lulav and esra represent that bound bundle, that aguda, and according to Abaya, also on Yom Kippur, or in any tanis, on any fast, when the wicked are included, they represent God's bundle, God's earthly bundle. Otherwise, the bundle is incomplete. I think there should be a special bracha on seltzer, like there is on bread. Seltzer is one of God's greatest creations. How they get those little bubbles in. They just go in there and they stay there, unless your kids leave the cap off. Anyway, the question then arises, this ideal of the bundle, how exactly does it function and what are its limits? Now, understand that during some periods in Jewish history, there was great suspicion. Even at the level of community inclusion, there was very great suspicion about the dangers of this bundle. And some achronim interpret the Gemara in Krisus, and I'm going to begin at one end of the spectrum and move toward the other. There were some achronim who said that this notion of including sinners only refers to sinners who have already said they want to repent. In other words, they have a bad past, but they have already rehabilitated themselves, at least in terms of attitude, and then you can welcome them in. The implication being that until that time, al tischaber lo rasha, the notion that you shouldn't have anything to do with wicked people, people who are still wicked do not belong in the community. Oh, now we already have been warned. The Torah has already given us a hint that this notion of including sinners, even if they didn't ask to be included, well, if they didn't ask to be included, one assumes that they have not exactly come around. They are still unrepentant. So that clearly, these achronim would not move with that. However, here we have an interesting mechanism mentioned by the Maharal. The Maharal says, why is it specifically that the fast day is mentioned? What does it mean, any fast that doesn't include sinners? What about other things? What about Shachris Mincha Mariv? Now it is true. When Rashi cites this idea, he says, Tanis utfil. He includes prayer. But the Maharal wants to go back to the strict construction and say that the reason you need to include the sinners is because the sinners, he doesn't say that they have to get, that they are prefixed, that they're good already and now they can come in. We don't hold their past against them. No. He says that what you want from these sinners is you want them in the act of contrition, the act of subjugating themselves to God. It is a little bit lahavdil, like certain evangelical groups, that if no one in the service actually hears the voice, if no one in front of our eyes is suddenly seared with the heat of faith, then everybody goes home disappointed. Like, this was boring. The whole thing was in English. Nobody talked in tongues. Last week Mrs. Jones said, it was great. We don't know what she was saying, but she was so emphatic about it. So the Maharal's notion is that the community needs to be in the presence of what he calls hachno, the act of making one's will subservient to God. And that is what makes the tiniest effective. Without it, it's like you left out the salt. You left out a key ingredient. The tiniest isn't the tiniest without this ferment of an individual in change. The Maharsha also was skeptical about the mixture of the basically righteous community with alien elements, looks at the case of the ketoras, of the incense, and notes one very interesting thing. He says, how many ingredients are there in the ketoras? There are 11. 10 plus the chelbana. Says the Maharsha, sure, you can tolerate a certain amount of moral nonconformity, if you will, aka wickedness. But you have to have a 10, you have to have the minion, you have to have, remember that Abraham, and the Maharsha mentions this, when Abraham is arguing with God to save the city of Sodom, he doesn't go any lower than 10. There has to be, and in 10 we mean the Eidah, in 10 we mean the organized community which represents corporate Israel's positive values and commitments. In other words, there has to be a base. Once there is that base, once there is that 10 can support a certain number of individuals who may be deviant. But not if it's 5 and 5. And there were, taking this Maharsha, there were those who even want to say it's a ratio. You can have one bad guy for every 10 good guys. Bad guy comes to the door, says, I'd like to come daven. They said, we're sorry, we don't have enough righteous people here yet. He said, what do you mean? You got 173 people. He says, we know, but we've already got 17 no-goodniks here. If we want to add one more, we're 7 short. Right? So not everyone sees the Maharsha in quite that instrumental a ratio, but at the very least, there has to be a base of upstanding citizens. Yes, Bella.
The problem is that we're now asking other people to judge. So that's in one person, is that they become judges about this. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is that they don't even go out to help themselves to be a little bit better, or those two parts that kind of...
Those are two very interesting questions. The first question is, in practical terms, how do you identify a Russia? Well, in the literature, generally speaking, a Russia was identified by one of two categories. And one of those categories went soft in the last 100 years. One category was a person who had embraced another faith, a person who was an idolater. So you can imagine if someone who has announced to the world that they are now a practicing Christian or Zoroastrian shows up in shul and has not yet officially renounced that faith, people were nervous. The other category is a person who violates the Sabbath. Now, the violation of the Sabbath in pre-modern times signaled almost the same rejection as embracing another faith. Right? That was Mechal Shabbos B'far Hesya. Already in the late 19th century, the rabbis in Germany recognized that there were Jews who were totally devoted to the faith in concept, but for whatever life conditions were not able to be Sabbath observers. So generally speaking, the notion that a person who is a non-Sabbath observer is automatically out of the community is no longer, it doesn't have the same impact. But if a person were officially practicing idolatry or another faith, it's very interesting that although the liberal Jewish movements are tolerant of every kind of behavior, they are tolerant of every kind of mixed marriage and alternative marriages and unions, etc. They tolerate every single one of those. They still have a blind spot for Christianity. To have someone who is a Jew who is actively preaching Christianity, they still have trouble with that, to the best of my knowledge. So even in the most liberal circles, some vestige of this notion of the outlier still exists. Now, on the second question, Bella, the question of why are we treating this person like a frozen object, instead of wondering, can we do something with them, right? Or is there a way to influence them? Well, that is probably the social worker in you talking, but because that discipline was invented by Jews, basically, there's no wonder that there's so much Yiddishkeit in it. According even to those first achronim, you remember the ones I said that the guy is, you take a guy in when he's already repenting? That doesn't mean you've put the burden on him. The community is charged on the eve of Yom Kippur to actively go and do everything they can to exert a positive influence on the individual, to sweeten the deal, so to speak, to urge them. So this is something, in certain ways, you want to know what's true to human nature and psychology and our assumptions. We have a lot of trouble with the idea that we are responsible for making someone else change their attitude. We're very, we're very respectful of other people's desire to play in traffic. Yeah.
What about an atheist who never enters the congregation?
That will be covered in one or two categories as we move toward the more... I gave you the real tough, I gave you the strong medicine first. We're going to get a little gentler as we move forward. Yes?
Is a Jew that became a Christian excluded from the synagogue if he decides to show up?
I don't know that you would throw him out. There are some places you would. If for example, if you were living in Lo Aleinu, if you were living in Nazi-occupied Poland, and there was someone who had gone on over to the other side and was active in the community of the people who were murdering our people, I think he'd be a little unwelcome.
Well, that's a different question.
Yeah, but remember that once upon a time, Danny, there wasn't this notion of well-meaning, unaffiliated people. A person who left the community generally left the community and joined another community, which was usually antipathetic to the Jewish community. But let's move on a little more. Things will get gentler. Bella will start to feel better and better as we keep moving through these alternatives. Now, as we talk about still keeping people out, the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer, you have to remember when the Chassam Sofer lived and with what he dealt. Chassam Sofer lives at the beginning of the Reform movement, where Jews were organizing themselves for alternatives to traditional Torah observance. And the Chassam Sofer invokes a passage in the book of Ezra, a very powerful passage in the book of Ezra. And the scene there is that the Jews are just coming back, in the 4th chapter, they're just coming back from Babylonia, and they have a mandate to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And the Samaritans, who had been brought into the land of Israel by the Assyrians, who had really been a thorn in the side of the Jewish community, Vayishma'u Sorei Yehuda uVinyamin Ki v'nei hagola bonim heichal Hashem Elokei Yisrael. They heard that the Jews returning from Babylonia with the mandate from the Persian kings, they were going to build a god. They were going to build a temple to the God of Israel. Vayikshu el Zerubbabel el Roshei ha'avos, and they approached Zerubbabel and the patriarchal head chiefs. Vayomer lehem nivnei mochem. We want to build with you. We want to be partners in this enterprise. Ki chachem nidrosh lelokechem v'lo anachnu zovchim mimei asar chadon melech Ashur amalo sonu po. What are you talking? We know your God very good. We've been worshiping and singing to Him since we got here. They brought us, he said, the king of Assyria has brought us here. We figured, okay, let's go local. So who's around here? Who's the local? The local is this God of Israel. So we'll make a davening, we'll do a thing, a sacrifice. It was lovely. What are you talking about? We've been on that team for an awful long time. We want to be part of the temple. Yomer lohem Zerubbabel v'Yeshua, Roshei ha'avos the Israel, lo lachem v'lanu livnos beis l'Elokeinu. It is not for you and us together to build the house to the Lord our God. Ki anachnu yachad nivneh l'Hashem Elokei Yisrael kasher tzivanu hamelech korosh melech paras. We, just us, we united together will build the house in accordance to the will of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, the Chassam Sofer was, among many other things, a genius of drush. So listen to this, you wouldn't believe it. He says, who do you make a deal with? Who do you bind together? The elements of the lulav. He says, the Roshei Tevos of lulav are Lochem V'lanu Livnos Beis Elokeinu. That's who is in. What do we hear in the book of Ezra? There's also the group Lo Lochem. In other words, not lulav. There are some who don't belong in the lulav. And this Chassam Sofer, without much hesitation, says, and that would include the Samaritans of their day, the Sadducees subsequent, and he widely says, and the Apikorsim of our time. In other words, those who represent an organized conceptual assault on the belief community of Israel. He says they don't belong in. So when he says Poshe Yisrael, he says check your lulav. And as one of the other Achronim, the Riach says, he says a lulav, yeah, you can put in a willow, What's wrong with the willow? The willow, it doesn't make any fruit, it has no tom, it has no fragrance, it's inert. No one tells you should stick in a thorn bush. Because the minute you add an element which is actively harmful to the others, that's a problem. So according to the Chassam Sofer, the limits of inclusion are guided by what is going to harm the base. To include that which is relatively inert, that which is harmless, even if it doesn't contribute a great deal, but it doesn't represent an assault on the values, that's okay. So you've got your lulav and you've got your low lulav, playing on these words in the book of Ezra. Now, if you want to compare that, I'm going through these options. The Maharsha is coming from a very different place. The Maharsha is saying that you need, the community can dilute people who are sinners. The Chassam Sofer says, depends what you're talking about. Are you talking about an organized ideology of sin, or are you talking about people who are simply non-observant or non-compliant? Now the question is, you might want to know, why are we, what is the mechanism? In other words, what actually is, what is happening here? And here we have from a 16th century Rav who wrote his commentary on the Torah. He tells us that there is a mechanism, and here it begins to look in Bella's direction. Because we're now going to, for the first time, we're looking at this from the point of view not of the insider, but of the outsider. What is the experience of the outsider being brought in? So the Drisha says that we bring this individual into the community, and as he comes into the community, he has this sense. He has this sense of what it is to be among the righteous. And the idea of being welcomed among the righteous reminds him that someday in paradise there will be the circle of the righteous. And the experience of being carried away by this atmosphere will make the individual, in other words, different from where we started, that it's an individual and we want to watch him crushed. This is no longer crushing at the end of the 16th century. This is someone who is being suddenly, he's being what?
Being included.
Being included. The inclusion elevates. In other words, suddenly the whole shul is singing a nigun. And this person who doesn't know a word of Hebrew suddenly finds herself or himself lifted up by this music and singing with them. By the time the Chazan does the fourth Hashem, Hashem, Kel Rachum V'Chanun of Ne'ilah, this person is weeping. Not because they know the meaning of the words, not because they've been instructed, but because to be part of something so majestic in its holiness makes them want to continue to be part of it. And you know what, I think this is true to the experience of many people who return to observance. It's the experience of being included, whether it's included at a wonderful Shabbos table or included in a war minyan. They suddenly realize, I feel closer to these people who are coming from such a different background. I feel closer to them than I've ever felt to my friends and to my own family in many cases. There's something here. I want to be in this circle. Yes, Charles.
I think it is emphasized, perhaps not in this sweet way, right at the beginning of Yom Kippur before Kol Nidre. And it says we have permission in this Palel in...
That's where I started. That's why I quoted the Torah. That is based on this notion of including the sinners. Anu matirim. What the Drisha is adding, right under that, he's commenting on that. How does it work? What happens? Answer that they suddenly see them, they imagine themselves as part of the community of the righteous, and it feels wonderful. And they project what it would be like to spend eternity in this kind of a community. And that ignites their aspiration. Yes, Jude?
Aren't you describing what Chabad does? They include everybody and make them feel welcome. And
Well, I don't want to give free ads to Chabad. I don't think they're the only ones who do it, but
Okay.
certainly that is their mandate.
Right.
And that is, you know, they've gone to the four corners of the world to try to do exactly that.
Right.
Okay? You will not get any argument from me on that question. The Shem Shmuel, who was teaching between the two world wars, the Shem Shmuel has a slightly different sense of the mechanism, and he backs it up with mystical imagery. The Shem Shmuel says, and let me see if I can get a little of his language for you because it's so beautiful. He says, Al karchach afilu be'odenu meruchak, even when the individual is still far, far away from a personal return to God. Afshar lehitztaref liktoros, he can still be part of the incense. Hainu, what that means is lehiskasher be'odenu sham, to bind himself, to hold, to be tied to it. L'moshal mishemushlach babor amuk. He gives a parable. Imagine someone who has fallen into a deep, deep pit. She'i afsharlo lalos, and he can't get out of the pit. Moridin lo chevel lesochabor. They lower a rope down into this pit. Kasher nikshar b'chevel. As soon as he is tied to this rope, he's still in the pit. Oz yeshlo aliyah al yedei achevel. He knows that the possibility of being raised up out of his pit is because of that rope. And he says, Im rotzim al kol ponim lihitztaref imanu. All we ask of this posheya, of this sinner, the desire to be connected, what we call affiliation, if you will. The desire to be connected to the community of Israel, the oz, ki al yedei zeh hem miskashrim b'knesses Yisrael. They are connected to the great enterprise, the greater house of Israel. I know even though they are still standing at some distance removed, mikol makom, al yedei ritzonom lehiskasher miskashrim b'klal Yisrael. Their desire to be part of things binds them to Klal Yisrael, and then here's where he gets mystical. V'oz ruach tahara overes bohem umorartem l'tshuva. That through this connection, almost like an umbilical cord, through this connection to the house of Israel, a pure spirit comes to them and awakens their desire for tshuva. What the Shem Shmuel is stressing, his imagery is just so magnificent. The Shem Shmuel is saying that a person who wants to be in a shul, a person who wants to be standing, even if it's only physical proximity, wants to be standing there in the room when the Chazan says, Kol nidre u'nesanet tokef. That desire itself has sacred value. And again, Bella, here we go. The Shem Shmuel is not talking about from the point of view of the community, but from the point of view of how this is mechanized, how this works upon upon the individual. Now the Droshos Haran was much, much earlier than all of these. He has a very interesting and simple formula. The Droshos Haran says that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and that an individual who is vastly imperfect, still a posheya, that individual is the piece that completes the puzzle called the Jewish people. When the Jewish people come before God complete, the whole, Klal Yisrael, calls upon a quality of divine mercy that they cannot call upon, even if the piece missing is of very little individual value. The whole needs all of its parts. And there's a fascinating, just think of a jigsaw puzzle. You know, those of you who are seasoned jigsaw puzzlers, you know those pieces you hate, the ones that are not an edge and that don't have any real design on them, right? Like some chalaria just cut out a piece of the perfectly blue sky or the blue ocean. There's nothing on this piece that can tell you where else do you put it. Where do you find that? When do you finally put that son of a gun in place? When the rest of the puzzle is complete and there's one thing missing. Oh, are you glad to have that little schmagegi to put in there? Because without that piece, you look at this 5,000 piece puzzle that you, like an idiot, have spent 43 hours completing. Your entire ski vacation, you were transfixed, but you never saw a flake. Sitting there all the time at this big table, munchkin with these little tiny pieces. Shame on you! You get to 4,999. Oh, you love that little bit of blue. God is waiting for that little bit of blue to love his people in its entirety. That's the principle of the Chidush of Droshos Haran. He says, don't think you can toss that piece because there's nothing on it. Sure, when you're starting your puzzle, you're looking for edges and pictures. Oh, look, this one's got a hedgehog on it. I know just where it goes. But just remember that there will come a time when you will love that little piece more than any, because that's the one that makes it complete. And so the Ran says it is in that spirit that we bring this puzzle together. Rabbi Yitzchak of Bardichev, who is our penultimate stop. Rabbi Yitzchak of Bardichev clearly lived at a time when there were many Jews who weren't true to the tradition. Not only were they not true to the tradition, they weren't even asking to come to shul. They wouldn't even come to shul if you begged them. So Rabbi Yitzchak of Bardichev has a very interesting turn on the Gemara in Krisus and on the whole idea of the Aguda. Rabbi Yitzchak says when the Gemara in Krisus tells us any fast that does not include the sinners of Israel, it doesn't mean that the sinners of Israel have to come in shul. It means that those who are in shul and who are davening, if they don't have the missing people in mind. Bo in it doesn't mean in the room. It means in the tinus itself. It means that every community's heart must remain unquiet as long as we are losing people. You can't You can't shrink the circle and pretend it's a whole circle. Says Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, this is not addressed to what do we do with Mr. A and Mrs. B who've turned their back on religion. This is about what do we pray for. It's about what goes on in the synagogue of the faithful. Says Rabbi Levi Yitzchok of Bardichev, if they are physically absent, then we must pray. Their absence must pain us, and we must pray for the Almighty to give them the gift of tshuva. Now this is a little problematic theologically, because we have the notion of Hakol b'dei Shamayim chutz miras Shamayim, that everything is in God's hands except for the fear of heaven. And all of these people who are not here are exercising their right of free choice, the right which gives God the power to reward people who do it correctly, but somebody's going to make the wrong choice, otherwise it isn't free. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yitzchok had this notion that you are allowed to pray for the tshuva, for the repentance of those who have distanced themselves. And now I'll come to one last stop on the train, if you permit me, because I know my time is short. And that is reaching back in time to the Rabbeinu Bechaya. The Rabbeinu Bechaya, in his commentary on this passage in Parshas Kisiso, where the incense is described. He says, the chelbana reicha ra, the chelbana, which is probably galbanum, I think is the stuff, it has a bad smell. Nevertheless, it is listed among the key ingredients. Uvolirmos, and it has come to allude to us. She'ein lanu lohakel b'rishoyim poshe Yisrael sheloyu bichlal kan yosenu tfiloseinu. That we should not make light of the absence of sinners from our fasting and our prayers. And his interpretation of this is why. Why are we so worried that there are people missing in the shul? Ubiur zeh ki shem shamayim misaleh umiskadesh b'shah shaharashoyim chosrim b'tshuva v'nimnim b'klal hatzadikim. First of all, God is pleased. God's name is sanctified when these people do choose to return and repent and to be counted in the congregation of the righteous. But then he goes up to another step. He says, She'im lo kain. If that does not happen, hatzadikim nitfosim aleim mipnei ha'arvus. If they are lightly dismissed, then the righteous are held accountable for them because of the concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebozeh. That Jews are morally accountable for one another. In other words, we're in one rowboat, and nobody drills a hole under his seat as a private act. And says the Rabbeinu Bechaya, that if the tzaddikim do not concern themselves with the others, if they draw into a comfortable circle where everybody is just like them, where the dugout is filled with high fives for what they already believe, if they surround themselves with the comfort of consensus, they will be held responsible for things that go on in a sphere they have chosen to ignore. because Jews are responsible for one another. I want to hear from my delicious friend Senta, and then I want to say another word about the Rabbeinu Bechaya. Yes, Senta.
It says in the Torah that we Jews are responsible for one another. It says so in the...
Exactly. That is exactly what Rabbeinu Bechaya is saying. You are on the money, as usual. Rabbeinu Bechaya says that not to concern yourself with the people who are not included, you will have the best Rosh Hashanah of your life. No one will talk. No one will ring their cell phone. You will daven like crazy. There'll just be one problem. The Rebbeinu Shalom is going to be listing your neighbors on your list. Mrs. Shipshank, did you know she was Jewish? Oh, you didn't know. Okay, that's one on yours. So you are having this glorious experience, but it is that. It is an experience. It is a cosmic disaster. Because it's predicated on surrounding yourself with comfort. Says Rabbeinu Bechaya, you have to at least be thinking, and this is a little bit like Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, but he says he seems to be more proactive. You have to at least be cognizant that we are being judged as a whole people, and everyone counts. And if we ignore them, then it's on our tab. I would just like to make one last, Chuck, you tell me what you think about this afterwards, and Michael. I'd like to make an analogy from the Rabbeinu Bechaya in the concept of the internal family therapy theory, which says that each of us actually is composed of many selves. Right? We have our better selves. We have the selves that we're not so crazy about, the selves who are indulgent, the selves who are angry, the selves who are jealous, etc., etc., etc. We have many selves. When we come to shul, whom do we bring with us? The average person just brings their shul selves. No, the side which is spiritual, the side which is benevolent, the side which really does wish everyone a good year. We bring a select set. We bring only the tzaddikim selves with us on Yom Kippur. Part of what Al Chet Shechatonu Lefonecho is supposed to remind us of is that knock. That's the knock on the door of the other selves who would also like, who need to come to shul. They need to know that the Ribono Shel Olam is aware of them as well. Worse, he loves them. He understands that much of what they do comes from a place of pain, a place of fear, a place of trauma. They need to come into shul. Knock, knock, knock is the poshim asking to be included in the miracle of Yom Kippur, of its forgiveness, of its announcement of the sheer power of the Ribono Shel Olam's love for us. They all want to be included. And that is also the message. Onu matirim lehispalel im ha'avaryonim. We hereby announce that we are welcoming into the shul all of us, but also all of me, all of myself. Because the ones I don't naturally think of as wanting to come to shul, they're the ones that need it the most. They're the ones that need it the most. Maybe that's why we start the Al-Chetz at Mincha before, so that by the time we welcome them in Anu Matirim Lihispalel Limavaryonim, we welcome the transgressors, we've already heard the knock. And we can open the door to them as well. You noticed I didn't give out any source sheets. This is my wife's pedagogic suggestion. However, if there is any, I have all these sources more or less out on my computer. If anyone would like a source sheet after the fact to review the various positions, if you care that much, I wouldn't bother you. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But if anyone feels that they need to go back and see the sources, I'd be very happy to give you a kind of a running bibliography with citations whenever you request them after the Shiur.
On those pieces of paper?
No, it will be on a new piece of paper.
You'll email it to us?
Well, Rena helps me with all those things. I'll make up the sheet, because I'll cut and paste from this, and Rena will be happy to send it to you. Well, she'll be happy, but she'll be willing. She'll pretend she's happy, and she's so nice. She does all of the... If not for Rena, there would be no shiurim. Not because she does the photocopying, and not because she runs the camera, but because she nudges me. And keeps telling me, someone asked me when you're giving your next shiur, and she says that.
That's me.
Yes, Rabbi, last word is yours.
You got a minute? So the question about the aravos, right? You make a bracha on the daled minim, 4 kinds, and it's got to include the aravos. And each one of the other 3 has a place. When one has a place in knowledge, and one has both knowledge and activity, and one is just one. And the aravos, make a bracha over aravos. And then so it always bothered me. I always wondered about it. And then when I was in California, I met a guy who was the brother of a woman who was a sort of a tomboy, and she became an aviatrix, and flew in a carnival. And her father was a very wealthy guy, and he bought a fleet of planes from the French in the 30s. And when they wondered, how are we going to fly these things, and how are we going to train Jews in Israel to fly these, he said, "Come to California, and my daughter, she'll train you." And she did. And not only that, but the Israelis, she trained them how to do flying the way she did, which is as a circus performer. So they were very adept at making rolls and doing things that ordinary combat pilots don't even bother with.
Wow.
And incidentally, eventually the Israelis issued a stamp in which they called her Aim Shel HaTayasim, the mother of the Israeli Air Force, and I said,
There was a picture of a smoking plane face down in Hartman.
Seriously, but she was, she was a wing walker and everything. It was really a strange, it was really a wonderful, it became a little lionized and so on. So I said, okay, finally, an arava, great. Right? And I said, all right. So I said this, in a drasha, and the doctor came over to me afterwards and said, I hate to tell you this, but as far as I'm concerned, the aravos are the most important part of the daled minim. And I said, really? Why? He said, as far as we know, this was the only ancient source of a substance that was used to treat pain, to treat the pain of childbirth, and eventually we came to know that the willow is the only natural source of salicylic acid, which is, everybody who remembers the old commercials, is the source of aspirin. And he says, as far as I'm concerned, the only bracha worth making, I'm a physician, and the only thing I'm interested in is the aravos. And I said, oh,
And
I
that's
asked
why
him-
when
I
they
even
get
asked
those
him-
Shana Rabbah, they get to be the star.
Right, so I asked him, how long has this been known? How long was it known? And not that's the salicylic acid part of it. How long was this used as a treatment for ailment and pain? He says it goes right back to the very beginning of history. The very beginning, it was used in Mesopotamia and so on. They didn't know, of course, they didn't know what the chemistry was, but they know this product, this willow leaf, was an ameliorative for the pain of childbirth, the pain of other pains, and so on, and it was widely used by physicians, of antiquity.
Parents have been taking aspirin for the headaches their children give them ever since.
But I mean, but isn't that an interesting idea? That here you see that the Aravos. Here I am for years thinking the Aravos need some kind of a reason for being.